One of the core skills associated with mentoring, both for the mentor and the mentee, is communication. And there are two aspects of that. When you listen, you learn. Where you share, you educate. And we're going to pick up on when you listen, you learn, because listening within communication is so important. And I know Doug has lots of stories associated with that. I have a few of how important listening is. And that's where we're going to go today in Mentoring Lounge, the All Things Mentoring Lounge. Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen Hobbs. I am Director of Certification for the International Mentoring Community. And we have
Doug Lawrence, Director of Education and Outreach.
Yes, welcome, Doug. And here we are again in the Mentoring Lounge, and listening is up for a look at today. Listen in on. I think it would be also helpful just to go over a little bit about communication to start. And I'll get us going here, because communication for me is actually three things. One, it's the message. So when we're in communication, the communication is the message. That's how often we look at it. The second thing, communication is about a process, about sending and receiving, and how you set that up in terms of corridors and barriers. And then the third one is, and it's kind of an interesting one, it's about coordinating the behavior of others. Therefore, the communication that we get into while using the message and this notion of sharing and receiving and all that, is that it actually is for the coordinating of the behavior of others, even if the person that you're interacting with, communicating with, does nothing. That's still a response that you can work with. And I think it's important for us to just sort of unpack that just a little bit more, so that people will have a baseline to work with, because of when we shared with this idea of when you listen, you learn. And that's where we're going to go with today's video. Is there anything in particular you want to add about communication to the mix here, Doug?
Underneath, I think all of that, what you've talked about, there are sort of the stepping stones towards being able to communicate effectively, of which listening is certainly an integral part. And so it's as we send and receive messages, they're helped along that communication pathway by, trigger words in the conversation, body language, crucial conversations, the use of questions, all of those things that are there to help enhance our ability to send and to receive information.
And I think it would be worth us coming back at another time in the All Things Mentoring Lounge and explore some of those topics, because I think there's a lot in there, and sometimes we just whoosh by them when in fact I think there's some things that we could do that really help people to hone their skills, even in how to ask a question. There's a lot in there, and I think we'll come back and take a look at that. But today, I think we're going to lean more towards listening, and the importance of listening from your perspective as a deep practitioner of mentoring. What would you say is the importance of listening from your perspective?
It's a foundational piece. I need to be present, and I need to be listening with my full attention on what the individual that I'm working with, what they're actually saying. Because, when they send that information, when they send that message, they're doing so for a reason or a purpose. And my job as their mentor is to be able to analyze, dissect that message to find out what is the underlying thing that we're trying to get to.
Right. So there is what I will call 7 elements of listening. I sometimes will use the phrase responsive listening. Other people might use active listening. And I think it's worth us just taking a look at each one. And I think that there's examples that we can give about how to strengthen those. Because again, it happens so instantaneously that we don't always unpack it. And you know, if you've been listening in on the All Things Mentoring Lounge, we'll use words like deeper and richer and unpacked and unfold, because what we're attempting to do here is give a little bit more just than the why and the how. It's also what resources go with it, or you know, what's the fit of what it is we're talking about in mentoring, and get into a bit of the when and the where, because often, and I think we've shared it quite a bit here about it, is we tend to go whooshing. I've used that already. We tend to move by things really quickly and just think, oh yeah, well, I know how to do that. I've been doing it for 40 years. I know how to listen, when in fact, I would encourage you to just slow down a little bit and join us as we unpack the 7 elements of listening. Seem like a fair way to go, Doug?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
yes, it is.
I think the first one that is really important, and we sometimes will use the word listening and use hearing and talk about them sort of as together. Well, hearing is actually an element of listening, because listening is made up of the 7 elements. And the hearing component is what I'll call attending to the sound. We hear sounds. And a lot of times when we're in conversations, the sounds are what we would refer to as words. But sometimes there's other sounds that are around a conversation, a yawn, okay? Now, I know we can see it, or a sigh. I know we can sometimes see it, but also is like using Zoom meetings. You may not always pick up on it right away versus in person. So attending to the sound and hearing it is in sort of the first step, the first essential element of listening. Comments?
No, I agree. I think the ability to be able to listen, and I'm going to keep dragging this back to being present in the moment, and providing that undivided attention to the person that is sending a message to you.
Yeah, and it also, it's to pick up on what it means to be safer, because sometimes you might hear sounds out in the periphery, and it might be someone coming into a room, or it might be someone getting close to your table if you're out having a conversation. Sometimes those sounds we don't really think about when we're mentoring, and we pick up on it a little bit later. But sometimes you got to pay attention to where you are so that you can ensure that safer approach for the mentee. So why don't we jump into the next essential, or the second essential. And if you're hearing the sound, then you're going to give it meaning. In other words, understand what you're attending to. And I'll use something like fire. If you're in a room with a bunch of people and someone was to come in and yell fire, you're attending to that sound, and depending on how it's said, fire, fire, it's a different understanding that you're going to give to that sound that you're attending to, because you're going to assign it some kind of meaning. So any thoughts about that element, that component?
I would say meaning and priority is how I'm going to respond to that particular sound. And using, the couple examples that you've given, I would assign a different priority to each one of those. And from there, that would determine or drive the action that I would actually take.
Yeah, and that goes into the third essential element, because while I may be understanding and giving it meaning, what's the meaning for me? All right. And that's where you're comprehending what you are hearing. And it's a subtle point, and it's to your example there, Doug, is that when someone has meaning, yeah, fire, but meaning to me right now means I've got to do something, right? or I hear a phrase that someone's putting themselves down a little bit, and I'm going to pick up on it because I'm going to give it more than just a first brush meaning of, oh yeah, it's been a miserable week, versus, oh, hang on a minute, the person's had a miserable week. What does that mean? A little bit more. I may have to ask, give me a little bit more to work with here. And that's the sort of that difference between what I'll call getting an understanding of the sound and words, and then comprehending them and what we would do with them as we move forward. And those are that's happening almost like instantaneous.
Yeah, and I guess the example I always revert to is the one where I was working with a young person and they got referred to me because the mentor that was working with them was having a difficult time. And so, long story short, what ended up occurring was, as I started to ask questions, the responses that I would get back were such that I don't think I can do that, or I'm not capable of doing that, which then that was sending me a message that here's an individual that may be struggling with self-esteem, self-confidence issues, and that we need to kind of drill down a little deeper to sort of find out what perhaps may be the root cause of that feeling or that behavior.
Yeah, and that gets into the next essential, which is the agreement is that, yes, I have the meaning, all right, in general, it means what to me now. Do I actually agree with that? Okay, because if we're paying attention, like you're saying, and you're understanding it, comprehending it, and then as you reflect on it, there is a deep and richer use of those words, those sounds, that valuing that's going to take place in terms of when you mentor. It's a little bit different than, you're having a day-to-day conversation with someone. But when you're in your mentoring, serving as a mentor, there's almost like this deeper, richer, there we go, there's the words, deeper, richer understanding and comprehending and reflecting has to take place with those words. And I know in my own life, when I've mentored and have been a mentee, to really stay, and you've used the phrase present, I mean, really be present with what is taking place. If you don't, things will slide by you so quick, because again, we take so much of our communication, our conversation for granted, when it's not a really great idea to do that. And I've noticed that being a mentor and being a mentee and watching the mentor just sort of skirt by something that I've said. So anything you want to add to the notion of the agreement and reflection?
No, I think you've covered off the key points that we needed to take a look at.
And I think the other part to this is that reflection in, reflection on. Reflection in is when you're in it. Reflection on is, can you take a step back and be present while with the person, but doing it from a little bit like an on level. And that takes a little bit more practice to be able to get there. But again, these are things that we can talk more about in terms of even the practice of reflecting in, reflecting on. Well, let's go to the next one, which is the fifth essential, and it's this notion of storage. You're hearing it, the meaning is there, you're agreeing with it. Now, what am I going to do with it? In my short-term memory, because I'm going to want to include it in a response, or am I going to store it? And sometimes, like for me, I might write it or draw it to the side because I don't want to lose that idea, but it's the storage of it. Where are you going to put it? And there's other times where in your own way, you just go, let that one just slides on through, and it's sort of gone, because it's really a question of remembering, right? Storage, remembering, and how you want to remember it. But I know we've talked about this many times, is when you're listening to someone and all of a sudden you start taking notes, the person sort of goes, oh, what's going on here? what's going on? Want to share a little bit about that one? And then, certainly add anything else to storage and remembering.
Most definitely. And it's interesting that you should go down that path, because I was thinking exactly the same thing. And I've had those situations where I've been setting up, doing one of the things I do is culture assessments, which involves some very deep and rich conversations that can, be very um, toxic in nature. And I've had situations where I've had my pen and paper out and I didn't ask for permission. I was just going to go ahead and make a few notes, and I was stopped cold in my tracks to say, "What are you doing?" And I'm just going to take a few notes here. No, you're not, because if you are, I'm gone. I'm out of here. And it was a whole thing around, when we're communicating, it's about creating that safe place as you've talked about. And they didn't feel that if I was writing stuff down, that I had their best interests in. And so then I had to listen very intently to what was being said and to what was the message that was part of that communication, in order to be able to make sure that I would remember it, and then I could write it down later when I was not, certainly not with them sitting directly in front of me.
Is there anything in particular? I know you do a lot of mentoring in the mental health area, and for someone to open up and to have a conversation with you, yet you need to write something down to remember in particular, because you're following a thread, a track, and you know that there's a lot coming at you. You could say, yeah, I'll write it down later in yourself, but how might you ask someone if it's okay to write down a note for yourself? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I like sometimes with some of the folks, it's, that, ooh, this is a very important thing that you've just shared. Would you mind if I made a note of it? So that, I can, so that I'll be able to remember it, because it's a piece of information that I would like to keep, and I can set it up that way. And sometimes I've had it where they've said, nah, no, sorry, no. And so then that's where, number one, the mentoring log is extremely important. And just as important is the ability to think of trigger words to help you recall bits and pieces of the conversation.
Yeah, and I remember you talking about that quite often, is, this notion of trigger words. My way of doing it is I have like a whiteboard in my head. And what I do is I draw it up on the side. And often you'll see me, even when we're doing the All Things Mentoring Lounge, my eyes sort of pop over to side or up and down. It's because I'm just going into my whiteboard to pick up things. And I have this drawing that I work with around listening. And I'll give it to you at the end here for people, so you can see maybe an image that's associated with this. So why don't we do the sixth essential, which is this: you're hearing, you're giving meaning, you're giving your meaning, you're the agreement, the storage, you're working all that. Guess what? Got to take an action. Do you respond, or do you let silence be your response? Looking for a little bit more from the person. What is it that it happens next? Is what is that response to what you just heard, what you're attending to, your presence with the person? And I always know is that we tend to listen a lot more to what we see. And I, for one, being a visual learner, I pick up things sometimes quicker than I do in an auditory fashion. So I really have to be present when I'm in a conversation with someone, and it's really deep and rich and important. So while it's helpful to see things, I also have to pick up what is actually being said too. And that's just something for me to think about. Thoughts around any of that?
So for me, a lot of times the listening part is extremely important, because especially with some of the mental health people, people dealing with mental health, is they don't want to hear what I'm thinking. So I have to be able to pick that up and be able to understand that, the venting or the ranting or whatever you want to call it that they're going through right now, they just need to do that in order to be able to clear that negative energy and get rid of it. And so as a result of that, it's not so much being in a position where I can say, well, have you thought about doing this? Because if I do that, that's going to just ramp them up even tighter. And so then it's a matter of being able to sit back and say, tell me more.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And for me, I'll use phrases like, continue to walk me through this, will you? Just, right? It's just because I like walking, and metaphorically, most people will pick up on, oh, okay, so we're on a walk. It's great if you're on a physical walk and doing some mentoring too. That's great. But you bring up a really, really good point there. And I think it might be worth, if you're listening, and just go back through that, listen to that again. All right, because there's something to be said for when you're having conversations, because in a mentor-mentee, you don't always know what's coming. And there might be a surprise statement that requires the silence and or tell me more, versus responding with something. And I have to watch that one too sometimes, because I get caught up in, yeah, I love to share this with you. And so that's why I always come back to these 7 essentials to look at from listening. And I think the 7th one, and this is where I'm going to share the image. If you actually draw a 7, okay, and you put like 6 lines up the sort of the trunk of the 7, and when you bring the branch out of the 7, that's the 7th, and that's the observing. So while you're going through these other 6, it's important to be doing the observing of what is taking place, not only of the person that you're interacting with, but the what's happening in the situation, so that what you can do is make sure it's safer for the person. You can't necessarily make it safe. You can make it safer for the person, because they're also there with you, and you don't know everything they're thinking and feeling. Therefore, you can't make it safe for them and coddle them and take care of it. You can make it safer so that you're being respectful and fair, right, in your interactions. It's a very big difference. Empathize, right, and things like that. So observing, any thoughts on the observing part of the story?
Well, for me, the observing part is, once again, being present, being there in the moment, and watching for all the telltale signs of, as we've been communicating back and forth, what do I sense? What do I feel? What do I see from your perspective as the receiver of any message that I'm sending? And conversely, how do I feel? Like from how do I look inside myself to be able to say, okay, this is what I heard. This is how I feel. Is this something I need to communicate back to my mentee, or is this something that I can wrestle with on my own without involving them or agitating them, especially when you're dealing with mental health? I want to keep, as you've mentioned, I want to keep the environment that we're in as safe as possible. And so I don't want to be the person that's kind of stirring the pot or pouring more gasoline on the fire.
Yeah. And while I use the letter 7 and the observing that's there, it's sort of like if you were to take another 7 and put on top of it, then that first observing is as you walk into, as you become present in the opportunity, the situation for listening. It's sort of like these elements are like the platform, and then you go actually into them, and you just keep putting them on top of each other, these 7s on top of each other. So I want people to understand is that it's just not walk in and start attending and hearing. You've got to walk in observing and then engage, because there might be some clues there, head down, looking away, which isn't how they normally greet you. Often they smile and sort of you know, maybe even get up and give you a handshake if you're meeting a certain, like in rooms or a cafe and things like that. So again, when you work with these 7 essentials, it's not like doom, 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 doom. Sometimes they're moving in and around each other, but the number 7 is just a great image to put the first 6, and then the observing is sort of the top part of the 7. Looks like we're getting close to closing off the mentoring lounge or around listening, and we talked a little bit about the communication that starts it up. So is there anything in particular that you want to share with everyone, Doug, that would bring our All Things Mentoring Lounge to a close?
The one thing that I would share is that there's a lot of good information that we have sent in our communication with people listening today. So we've sent some really good information, and I encourage people to take the time to play that back and to listen to what the messages are that we have been giving over the course of this last little while, and to be able to then think about how am I going to put that to practice.
Yes, agreed. Well, thanks again. Another great All Things Mentoring Lounge, which happens on the 1st and 3rd Wednesdays of the month. So with that, Doug, thanks again for another great All Things Mentoring Lounge, and learning a little bit more about listening and the 7 essentials of it. Again, 1st and 3rd Wednesdays of a month is when we are into the All Things Mentoring Lounge. Certainly encourage you to join us. And please, if you have something you'd like us to go over, or a question you might have, we'll get it into the Mentoring Lounge. In the new year, we will be going live on YouTube and maybe one of the other social media platforms. So it will be just as it happens is what happens. And I'm looking forward to that as we move into the new year of 2022. So again, 1st and 3rd Wednesdays of the month, 10 a.m. Mountain, and the 2nd and 4th, and sometimes 5th, there might be an article that we put up on a Wednesday so that it's available for you. So with that, great. Again, take care, Doug. We'll catch up to you again later.
All right.